The blackness was all surrounding, and it was just that. It wasn't dark, it was black, and it consumed all, except for a just as consuming buzzing. At the same time, it was somehow simultaneously nothing and complete sensory overload, utterly flooding the brain with so much nothingness that it didn't know how to handle it in any other way than shutting down and tuning everything out, as the darkness and sound buried into the mind through whatever opening they could find within eyes and ears. Blinded by the brightest darkness and deafened by the loudest silence, the brain could do nothing more than wallow in it, as nothing else remained while everything was consumed. That was, however, until it was suddenly overpowered. At first, the darkness was banished away as light came flooding in. It was weak, and barely managing to seep through the darkness. However, it managed to, nevertheless, slightly illuminating the darkness just enough so it could be felt. Next, there was the sound. A sound gradually breaking through the buzzing, much more aggressively so than the light, as this sound wasn't satisfied with simply pushing a bit of the consuming noise aside. Instead, it came in waves, pushing on, not giving up until it could finally make itself understood. Sir? Sir? It came through, gradually becoming more and more intelligible, with each time it pushed itself against the buzzing. But what was it saying? Sir! With a jolt, James shot back into awareness. He would have probably lurched forwards, had it not been for the fact that both of his shoulders were currently weighed down by what he didn't know at the time were two sleeping bodies pressed against them. He blinked against the light, suddenly flooding over his retinas, as he tried to get an idea of his current location and situation. Which was something that probably would have been a lot easier if the room hadn't been spinning and swaying in front of his eyes, as if he had inadvertently entered a theme park funhouse. Although it became apparent pretty quickly that it was really his head that was spinning, not the room. Well, since there was gravity, the room was also... Sir, Lieutenant Aldwin. The deep voice that had woken him up spoke again just before James's incredibly distracted mind could spiral itself into an internal debate of what exactly qualified as a spinning room. Can you hear me? Before he even knew it, James was heavily nodding his head, only to then immediately realize just what a bad idea that was, as he felt like the insides of his skull were wildly sloshing around with each movement, while an amazing feeling of pressure began to push against the back sides of his eyeballs. Staggering for a moment, James tried to reach for his painfully thumping head to try and give it at least some sort of stability, as he recovered from nodding of all things. However, his arm didn't get very far. It was at precisely that moment that James realized both of his arms were currently being held onto tightly by the rather strong arms of Shida and Coco to his left and right, respectively. The both of them seemed to be sleeping even deeper than he had been, and showed no obvious signs of waking up, even as his arms had briefly struggled against their hold, while he had not yet realized what his current situation was. The expressions on their faces were peaceful and relaxed, seemingly taking a moment to be unburdened by all the stress and anxiety that had been following all of them for a long time now while they slept. And, although it was immediately hitting a certain calm yet protective part of his brain quite positively to see them like that, James did have to wonder how exactly they had ended up in this current position. No way they had deliberately gone to sleep like this, just leaned against each other in the wall somewhere in the floor, right? Where were they anyway? Lieutenant! The voice repeated itself, and finally James's brain found enough situational awareness within itself to actually order his body to turn to the source of it, which had to be someone very clearly trying to communicate with him. As he lifted his gaze up to the person who was so patiently trying to get his attention, his eyes refused to focus for a second, leaving them as nothing more than a dark, wobbly silhouette against the bright lights shining down from the ceiling, that probably weren't as bright as his still painfully throbbing brain was trying to tell him here. Yes, I'm awake, James replied, quickly trying to blink the blurriness out of his eyes so he could actually meet the gaze of his interlocutor. He swore up and down that he most certainly knew that deep voice. However, his currently rather swimming memory refused to spit out any name or face that matched with the sound. There was a mildly unbelieving snort coming from the To him, utterly unidentifiable person standing not even a step away as they cross their arms. "Well, your phone is buzzing," they then informed him with a deep chuckle, that nevertheless didn't sound all that humorous. Snapping his attention around now that it had been made aware of the obvious, James indeed began to feel something strongly vibrating in his pockets, to the point where it was hard to believe that he had basically not noticed it up until right now. "Shoot," he quickly mumbled, and began to try to pull his right arm out of Coco's pretty firm hug around it once again. This time, he was of course mindful of her hold, and with a bit more force behind his paw, as well as a few wiggling motion of his luckily very flexible mechanical arm, the appendage managed to wind itself out of Coco's affectionate clutch. Once free, it swiftly swooped down into his pocket, only missing the entrance 2 times before he actually managed to pull out the device to try and accept the call. "This is James Aldwin," he eloquently answered the phone, internally urging his tongue to please just obey his commands as he pressed the device to the side of his head. "Hello, James." A familiar, synthetic-sounding voice quickly replied to him, sounding ever so slightly worried by the greeting it had gotten. "Are you all right? You sound a bit slurring." Curie had hesitated for a moment, quite likely trying to think of a way to more politely describe the way that James was sounding to them, and failing in the process. "Yeah, I'm good," James tried to reply, in a way that would make the answer sound believable, and most likely failing at that just as much. "Just had a bit of a night, you know." There was a brief moment of silence before Curie replied, "I understand completely. I hope you had a nice celebration of your birthday. However, this might mean it is a bad time for a call." Although it wasn't a video call, James quickly shook his head to deny his friend's words, and once again he immediately got to regret the movements, as it felt like his brain was loosely swimming around in his skull. "What? No, it could never be a bad time for you, Curie," he assured jovially, despite the insistent headache, feeling himself slightly swaying, even while just sitting there. "What did you want to talk to me about?" He tried to sit up straight as he got ready to listen to his friend's explanations, but even that proved to be a bit more of a challenge than he had anticipated. Once again, Curie hesitated. "Well, I am calling to tell you that, what I mean to say is that I am in..." Curie stumbled over their words for a moment, clearly trying their best to bring what they had to say across in a way that would take the smallest possible toll on James in his current situation. Already, even the drunkest mind of the human could pick up on the fact that the cyborg had to be pretty nervous for their sentences to come out like that, causing him to listen up even more. Ultimately, the cyborg released a noise from their voice box that sounded a bit disappointed with themselves, as they finally just got out with it. "I wanted to call you because Warrant Officer Reprieg has unexpectedly approached me here on the station. He claims that he means no harm, and that he wishes to talk to me about the possibility of getting a replacement for his lost leg. I do not believe him, especially since he has come brandishing a weapon that could actually cause great harm to me. However, I am interested in finding out what his true intentions are, which is why I agreed to a conversation with him." As Curie quite succinctly explained their situation, with a quick pace to their words, and James's inebriated mind took a long second to catch up to everything they said, a second, familiarly nasal voice chimed into the conversation from the background, clearly standing a few steps away from the phone as it spoke. "You do realize I can hear every word you are saying, right?" it said, although even just the final word had already overclocked James's barely running brain, especially as it finally caught up to what Curie had told him earlier. Approached? New leg? Weapon? Immediately, all of his earlier leftover jovial demeanor disappeared, as if a flip had been switched. His face hardened, and his headache was pushed into the background at once, as stress hormones began to reclaim his bloodstream from the ethanol. "He also wanted to congratulate you to your birthday as well," Curie meanwhile added onto their previous statement, very clearly ignoring Reprieg's interjection to get all the information to James that they felt he would need. "Reprieg?" James basically growled, thinking back to how long it had been since he had seen the overgrown rodent, that had played no small part in putting him in this current situation. Yes, it had been a while. However, underneath a guise of reasonable thought, the feelings that he felt were still quite fresh. And, well, in his current state, his brain was mostly out of reason for a time. "Curie, could you put him on the phone for me?" It almost seemed like Curie had expected him to ask that, because they didn't even acknowledge his request or hesitate for a second, before James could already hear the mild rustling of the phone on the other end, being passed around. A moment later, the voice that had interrupted the conversation earlier returned, now in full force as it was no longer away from the microphone. "Hello, James," Repeat greeted, in a tone that was casual but also had an underlying tone of trying to poke at the human. Although, admittedly, James may just have been imagining that. "A happy birthday from me as well. Quite the year you survived this time." James could feel and hear his teeth inadvertently grinding, as the all-too-familiar voice simply struck a very bad chord within his mind, especially in his current condition. "Listen here, you," James said, his speech significantly sobering up from all the adrenaline in his blood, even though he did have to pause for a moment, as he tried his absolute hardest to come up with a better insult than just calling the Sippersling a rat. As nothing really came to mind outside of childish profanities, he decided to simply skip the insult and get right to what he wanted to say. "I don't know what you are trying to pull there, but let me tell you one thing. You're already on my shed list, so if you even so much as think about doing anything to Curie, anything at all, and if it's just slightly staining their exoskeleton, you can be sure that I am going to drop everything, come over there, and— Hey!" Despite all of the deadly sincerity in his words, James didn't actually get to finish his threat, as his phone was suddenly plucked out of his hand, with all the difficulty of an overripe fruit being picked from a tree. Shooting around to follow the culprit of the sudden theft and interruption, he was ready to lambast whoever had taken it at a moment's notice, until his now finely focused eyes actually recognized just who it had been that had woken him up there. "Excuse the interruption. This is Vice Admiral Celestin Cadsty of the UHSDF," the tall, dark-skinned man said into the phone's microphone, holding the device up to his ear while shooting James's brief attempt at a protest down, with a burning glare from his almost black eyes. "I would like to inform you that the still remaining agents of humanity's intelligence agencies on Nestantiot Station will be informed about your presence, and that any unlawful actions on your part will be punished to the full extent of the law. As you both are with a person of interest and represent one yourself in the currently investigated case, your actions will be monitored to a degree. You will be treated fairly, but with the necessary caution. Now, please, would you hand the phone back to Curie?" James obviously couldn't hear if there was a reply, as all he could do was sit there and look up at the rather rare sight of a place in the sun's second in command. Kazadi tapped his foot slightly impatiently, standing with one arm across his chest, while the other held the phone, a no-nonsense expression on his face. His black hair was braided into cornrows that were tied together into a pinned-up pseudo-ponytail on the back of his head. Something about this man's aura managed to make even James not want to interrupt his current conversation, which was quite the feat, all things considered. After a few seconds of waiting, there finally seemed to be movement on the other side of the line, and the Vice Admiral once again spoke up. "Curie, this is Vice Admiral Cassidy. I'm speaking on behalf of the Ambassador given his current condition," the man then explained quickly to the cyborg, in a deep, very direct tone of voice. "We will make sure that you are looked out for to the best of our ability in your current situation. However, I still implore you to be careful. I cannot give you orders, but if at any point you get even the remote feeling like that man might put you in danger, I can only implore you to please disengage and notify both the local law enforcement as well as our present agents, alright? Your safety has to have priority for you over anything else. Do you understand me? Alright. I will make sure Lieutenant Orwin calls you back once he is in the right condition to do so. Be safe." After waiting for a second, presumably to listen to Curie's answer, Kazadi then hung up the call, almost immediately reaching down to hand James's phone back. James squirmed slightly on the ground, as his drunk brain was not at all sure what to make of this entire situation. I'm pretty sure it's gotta be some kind of misdemeanor to take the phone away from a council candidate and speak for him without permission, he grumbled under his breath, and avoided eye contact by staring at his phone as he reached for it. With everything going on, he didn't really know just how pissed off at the situation he actually wanted to be. However, at least he figured that Cassidy actually said everything important that had to be said, and if he was actually going to notify Reason, that was all the better. And so, James's current emotional switch flipped once again, causing him to near instantly mellow out. If there was anything he didn't want to do right now, it was to let his anger about past events and worry about his friend out on the wrong person. I have a policy about not letting any of my officers make important phone calls while drunk, the Vice Admiral explained very directly, with a tone that didn't waste any emotions that weren't absolutely necessary. That applies to anyone, be they lieutenants, councilmen, or even your mother. Once James had successfully stuffed his phone away again, only briefly taking note of the array of missed calls that had once again piled up within his notifications, a hand suddenly descended into his field of view yet again, turning an open palm to him in an invitation to be taken. Sighing slightly, James glanced down to Shida, who was still occupying the arm that he hadn't yet freed from its affectionate cage. And to be honest, he didn't even really know if he wanted to. Actually, that was a lie. He didn't want to. He wanted to sit there and let her keep hogging his arm while he closed his eyes and rode out this hangover. However, I'm guessing you didn't just come here to tell me to pick up my phone, he suspected, and gently began to try to wiggle his organic arm out of Shida's embrace, which proved to be a lot more difficult with it not being able to perform the same undulating motions that its mechanical counterpart could. Honestly, he scarcely believed that Shida actually remained asleep during his entire attempt to free himself, even if he was careful not to wake her. She must have been really out of it after whatever had happened. James's memory was currently drawing a blank on anything that happened after Coco had suggested that the two of them would match each other on every drink they had. In hindsight, he really needed to start to say no to that woman. Eventually, he actually managed to pull his arm out of Shida's embrace, and, due to a lack of confidence in getting up himself, he then gratefully took the offered hand of the Vice Admiral, allowing the tall man to pull him out of the current sandwich situation. Once he was removed as a support in the middle, it left Coco and Shida to slowly tip over and slump against each other. Though, luckily, they didn't seem all too bothered about that, as they quickly shifted their position a bit so their heads wouldn't directly press against each other, soon enough nuzzling into a new arrangement of holding each other in a semi-sitting position. No, I certainly didn't, Cassidy confirmed once James was up on his slightly wobbly feet. And I'm sorry for interrupting your well-deserved rest, but there has been something that we would like you to have a look at. An identification, to be precise. We tried our best to do it using algorithms and artificial intelligence to find a match. However, our set of data is rather limited. Therefore, we decided that it would be best to get your opinion. Although, after what we just learned moments ago, it may no longer be necessary. James's face scrunched up a bit as he listened, his very much impaired mind struggling to catch up to its usual speed. Still, even if it felt like an eternity, it only took him a few seconds to put the pieces together. His eyes widened as he stared at the Vice Admiral. One of them is here too? He asked, with his voice almost failing him, as his tongue nearly refused him service yet again, though a newly emerging rush of adrenaline may soon rectify that. Just a second longer of going down the logical path also told him who it most likely was. They were on the Quavery homeworld, after all. He figured that only one of his former stalkers could move undetected for so long around here. Scifi, he mumbled under his breath, as his expression turned thoughtful. Of course. It just had to be the most dangerous one of them. That's what we're suspecting, Cassidy confirmed with a nod, and indicated for James to come along with him, as he turned to the room's exit. The expression on the man's very slightly wrinkly face was stern and serious, but also calm. He truly gave off the air of someone who had been through it all, and couldn't be shaken by any new development quite so easily. We haven't managed to get any direct footage of her, as any footage replaced by the loop was entirely corrupted. However, after a lot of digging, We did manage to find an out-of-place voice recording that was documented by one of the local voice control systems. We got onto the trail when one of the agents discovered that one of the admin's control clearances had been used in a pattern that did not match with their own account of their movements of that night. A bit more digging then showed that the file containing their voice pattern recognition appeared to have been temporarily tampered with. James could do little more than nod, along with the Vice Admiral, as he followed him to wherever he was supposed to listen to the sample of what was presumably Warrant Officer Scifi's voice. When it came to most things technology, he still considered himself a bit behind the bell curve when it came to knowledge, so he had no idea how much skill and investigation had actually gone into unraveling this whole scenario, but something told him that he should probably be a bit impressed, even if that was just his own naivety. As he thought about that, he stared at the Vice Admiral's face absent-mindedly. When seeing someone like Cassidy, who was more than a head taller and looked significantly more experienced based on appearances alone, in comparison to James's mother, it was sometimes hard to fathom which of the two was the one in charge, especially for James. Although, at least to him, it didn't exactly seem like the man had any designs of taking over the position in the commander's seat at the bridge for more time than necessary. Still, while he was in charge, he was very clearly determined to do a good job with it. Neither of them said any more as they quickly traversed the Sun's hallways. They just internally prepared for the moment when James would likely confirm for certain what they both already knew to be true. However, right as they were just about to enter one of the elevators that could carry them between the different levels of the Sun, their mutual silence was suddenly interrupted as the entire ship was suddenly filled by a not especially loud, but most certainly piercing and prominent sound that erupted out of every single speaker, amplifier, and terminal that the enormous atrocity class had to offer. To the layman, it probably would have just been an annoying sound. However, to the trained ears of the two officers, it immediately set off alarm bells, most likely because it was an actual alarm. A UFO, James mumbled, as he looked around a bit, his brain instinctively searching for the source of the alarm noise, even if it was both irrelevant and literally coming from all around. Almost immediately, the Vice Admiral had a finger on an earpiece and loudly ordered, "Report!" He listened for a moment to something that James couldn't hear, though thankfully he then turned to him and relayed the message only a moment after he had gotten it. "Non-permitted hyperspace stretches have appeared in the system. 6 of them total," he explained in no uncertain terms, before hurrying into the elevator that had already arrived for them, pulling James along in case his drunk brain was too slow on the uptake. "I'm going to need you to get into one of the safe rooms, sir. I will send to have your team brought there as well." James blinked a couple of times as everything began to move quite quickly. "Can't we just collapse the hyperspace?" he asked outright, his brain spitting out the idea before he could realize how unfitting of a plan that was. Expectedly, Cassidy shook his head. "This isn't our territory. We don't have that kind of jurisdiction here. Besides, we have no idea if they are even hostiles right now," he explained in no uncertain terms, as he hit the button for the elevator to approach the ship's core area. "Still, we should take every precaution in case they turn out to be just that, and therefore you have to get into the safe room right now. I will make contact with the Admiral and coordinate our response." For a second, James was hell-bent on protesting against that. However, his ego soon enough deflated as the recent words of his mother echoed in his mind. "Who do you think you are?" Unlike Shida or Coco, he was about as useful as a screen door on a submarine when it came to a space battle, even if he hadn't been shit-faced right then. His presence on the bridge or a similarly important place would literally only complicate things, and he simply had to swallow his pride and admit that to himself. "Understood, sir," he said with a nod that directed his gaze towards the floor. "I will make my way there myself. You should be handling more important things than my escort right now. Just please make sure that everyone gets to safety who can't go themselves." "Of course, sir," Cassidy replied with what seemed like earnest respect. "I will send for them right away. Rest assured that we will do everything in our power to keep things peaceful and under control, just like you would." James nodded again. He had already felt himself getting lighter during the entire ride. Now, the elevator arrived at its destination with a familiar ding. With the alarm still blaring, James quickly stepped out to free up the lift so the Admiral could get where he needed to go without any further delay. Turning, he gave the Vice Admiral a quick salute, which the man returned with an honest expression. "Best of luck," James just about managed to wish before the doors of the elevator closed between them again. Then, he immediately turned to hurry to the safe room. Better to not cause any more problems here.
"No, you did the right thing. The identification can wait until there is no immediate danger,"
Admiral Krieger confirmed with a stern expression after the situation had been relayed to her by the Vice Admiral. Across from her, Governor Scifi was on his own assistant and currently being briefed about the very same situation by his own people. "Implement a barricade," he ordered as an immediate action. "I do not want any non-permitted ships in our space to move as they please, you understand? And get a calculation going to determine where the stretches most likely originate. I do not care who is coming. I will not allow our territory to be violated like this." Once he had finished his orders, he looked over at the Admiral. "I must request that your ships do not engage whatever invaders may be approaching there. This is an affair of the Quaverie, and I do not wish for you to interfere," he said firmly. A twinge of annoyance hit the Admiral as she listened to his demands.
"As official members of the galactic community, we are still on the same side. There is no shame in requesting our assistance in dealing with the matter," she informed him clearly and directly.
However, the governor seemed to remain stubborn as he shook his head with a displeased strum of his voice. "How incompetent would it make us seem if we couldn't handle 6 mere ships in our own home space?" he asked rhetorically, and crossed many of his flexible arms while leaving one to gesture as he spoke. "I am quite certain we can handle it, don't you worry. No need to risk your soldiers and resources." Only very slightly twitching the corner of her mouth downwards, the Admiral released a dismissive sigh as she put her hands onto her hips.
"Very well, but should our ships perceive a danger to them at any point, they are going to defend themselves,"
she informed, in no uncertain terms, or throwing a sharp look at the ivory giant. "Of course," Governor Scifi concurred with a nod, before gathering some of his things from the large desk in between them, with a few quick movements of his long, thin arms. "If you would excuse me, this matter is going to need my full attention." To that, Krieger could only nod.
"I will return to my ship to coordinate our response as well,"
she said, as she briefly stroked across her uniform to smooth it out.
"My planetsat platoons will remain on site and continue to support the investigation."
"That is fine by me," Scifi confirmed with a nod of his large head, before moving towards the room's exit, gesturing for Krieger to walk with him for a bit. As Krieger moved to follow him, he briefly checked on his assistant once again, but then whatever he saw caused him to pause. "That's odd," he mumbled, as he stared down at the screen with his intense blue eyes.
"What's wrong?"
Krieger asked directly, not wishing to remain in the dark for even a second too long in their current situation. Scifi shook his head briefly as his focus returned to the present moment. "My carriage appears to have been moved to a couple of blocks away," he then informed after a moment of thought, clearly having checked some sort of ride tracker or something of the like. "Yet I instructed my chauffeur to wait for me by the entrance, and even if he had to move, he would have notified me." Before he had even finished his explanation, Admiral Krieger's hand was already on the white grip of her pistol, removing the safety from the weapon. Then, she reached up for her earpiece with her free hand.
"Squad leaders, roll call and report," she ordered firmly.
"Squad 1, West Wing North, all quiet," the first voice came in, followed by several more. "Squad 2, West Wing South, all quiet."
"Squad 3, East Wing North, all quiet."
"Squad 4, East Wing South, all quiet."
"Squad 5, Center North, all quiet."
Admiral Krieger blinked a couple of times as she waited, her grimace growing fiercer by the moment.
"Squad 6,
she asked directly, her gaze sharpening as she looked into the empty air with her hand on her earpiece.
"Squad 6, report. Do you copy, Squad 6?
However, the line remained quiet, especially since everyone else knew to shut up as she waited for an answer. "Squad 6 was the one by the main entrance, wasn't it?" Scifi said with a tone of realization. Krieger's expression grew even sterner as she shook her head.
"To all squad leaders," she then loudly announced over the line. Squad 6 is to be officially considered MIA. Secure your positions, secure the civilians, and then converge on the central location of Squad 6 in an orderly manner. And watch your backs. I don't want anyone else losing contact. This building is from now on officially hostile ground. Understood?
Copy that, ma'am. One squad leader after the next confirmed over the comm line, before Krieger turned to Scifi. With a nod, the governor didn't need to be told anything else as he quickly opened the room's door, revealing the soldiers of both Quavery and human nature behind it. Obviously, they were all already awaiting just that after listening to the earlier communications.
Keep sharp,
Krieger ordered her own soldiers, as she pulled her large firearm from his holster.
Act as if we are under attack, because we very well might be.
Yes, ma'am, the soldiers replied with a quick salute, before they immediately moved into a defensive formation. Meanwhile, the Quavery quickly moved to either side of the governor to guard him more directly, which was just fine by the admiral. Less of a likelihood of either of them getting in the way. With her weapon at the ready, she then gestured for everyone to get moving, while her free hand once again reached for her earpiece, discreetly shifting its frequency.
We lost contact to one squad. It might take me a bit longer. Keep things going and don't you dare lose my ship,
she ordered over the direct line to her second-in-command. Understood, ma'am, Celestin replied without a moment's delay. Be careful down there. Suddenly, the oddest sound that the Admiral had ever heard, and most likely would ever hear, erupted, cutting off her Vice Admiral's words. The only thing she could equate it to was a mixture between the cracking of a discharging electric arc and the absolute thunder of an enormous plate of ice breaking apart, reverberating over its entire surface like the end of the world. Even if this was a much, much quieter version of that. Just the sound profile was the same, not the volume. "What in the?" was all that she could hear one of her men shout a moment later, before his voice was suddenly silenced, yet her eyes couldn't quite believe what they were seeing right before them. Something that she could only describe as a sort of mirage or distortion in the air was coming straight towards them at an unbelievable speed. So fast, in fact, that her eyes could only process the movement after it had already happened. And the same was true for what had happened to her soldiers. Although the strange hazy air looked like it was just like any other trick of the light, it in no way behaved like it was, as it collided with her subordinates' bodies. Instead, it crashed against them like a physical mass, pushing them back and dragging them along with it, as if they had been hit by an oncoming train. By the look of things, they were dead on impact. And as much as she hated to think it, they were probably lucky that that was the case, because whatever that alien phenomenon unfolding in front of her may have been, its destructive nature by no means ended with just the force it was putting out. No, whatever it was, it seemed to be putting out an incredible amount of energy as well. Near instantly, it caused the soldiers' clothes and skin making direct contact with it to evaporate, while the rest of their bodies began to quite literally boil, their skin bulging and billowing as their vaporized blood pressed against it from the inside, eventually bursting out in geysers of steam and clotted blood once the skin had been weakened by deep blisters that the heat caused to sprout all over it. The gruesome imagery instantly burned itself into the Admiral's eye, even if she would only truly see it moments later, when her brain would have time to process the incoming signals. Not that it was given the time to do so in peace, because before she had even fully blinked, she suddenly found herself thrown back, as the enormous force also crashed against her. Although, the fact that she was thrown back, and that she could even form these thoughts, meant that it must have stopped before reaching her completely. As her body hit the ground, she could clearly hear the sound of multiple others doing the same around her, one after another, though she suspected not many of them had been as lucky as she was. She would have mourned their loss, however once again she didn't really get to do so, because after she had stopped rolling from the heavy hit, she made the mistake to glance down at herself. And as her eyes fell onto the site of her leg, very clearly able to see her own broken femur after just the brief contact it made had been enough for the phenomenon to completely bisect her leg with sheer heat alone, the accompanying pain finally set in.